Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar organized by the Malta Chamber of SMEs. Today's webinar will be focusing on acknowledging COVID and moving on. As you are aware, also following yesterday's press conference by the Prime Minister, Dr. Roberta Bella, now more things are getting back to normal, including all businesses as from Friday, 5th June. And therefore, today's webinar will focus on moving on. And our guest speaker will be Dr. Mark Schwireb. Dr. Mark Schwireb is a psychiatrist, and also he's specialized in crisis management and a founder of the Crisis Resolution Malta and Fondazzionis, of course, Fil-Pront. Before we start today's webinar, I would like to welcome also those following us live on Facebook, since as Malta Chamber of SMEs, we know that this webinar is very important also with regards mental health and also getting back to work. We wanted to make this webinar public to as much as possible. So feel free to share our live video from our Facebook page, Malta Chamber of SMEs, and I encourage those following us on Zoom. You will be able to ask questions or clarifications to Dr. Schwireb, but I encourage you also to share our Facebook live video and like our page, Malta Chamber of SMEs. Those that they would like to receive alerts from the Malta Chamber of SMEs, we have the WhatsApp group, and you simply need to subscribe to WhatsApp and subscribe to this number 99995199, and you will receive alerts and updates by the Malta Chamber of SMEs. So now I would like to invite Dr. Mark Schwireb. Dr. Schwireb, good afternoon. Your mic, sorry. Maybe you need to, one moment. Okay, don't worry. So, by the time Dr. Schwireb connects his microphone, I would also like to mention that, especially to members of the Malta Chamber of SMEs, that during the following weeks we will have, as we did during the last 12 weeks, we had several webinars, and in the coming weeks we will also have more webinars, also focusing on the COVID budget, which will be announced on Monday, the budget related to COVID-19. It's a special budget, and therefore we will also update our members regarding what's going to be announced during this special budget. So I think Dr. Schwireb is now.
Okay, right. That's the
very good. Good afternoon, Dr. Schwireb.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Welcome. I'll say welcome. It's an honor for me to be part of your, as it were, series of webinars. I know you're doing a lot of work. I'm going to be speaking in English, obviously, out of respect to those people who perhaps don't understand the Maltese language. But forgive me if I slip into Maltese every now and again, but I'll try my best to.
No problem at all.
Go back to English. Okay, so essentially, what I wanted to tell you straight away is that there is no magic formula for what is going on at the moment. It's obvious that right now there's uncertainty. Uncertainty is probably the key word at the moment. But I'm going to try and tell you in this webinar, which is going to last about 45 minutes, how you can handle this uncertainty and transform a crisis into an opportunity. But I have to tell you straight away, because right now we are seeing people who are struggling a lot. The other important message, I think, is to reach out. And this is why I have to thank Abigail and people like Fabian for actually inviting me to talk, because this is precisely what it is. If you forget everything about these 40 minutes, I think what I'd really like to share with you is the fact that you're not alone in this, that it is temporary, and also that there are always options. So without further ado, I'm going to try my best at sharing the screen. I hope I do this properly. So. Right, can you see that?
Not yet. Not yet.
Okay, so let's try and go. I think Fabian need to allow me to share the screen.
Yes. Seems like yes.
All good to go from my end. Just tell me. Right. I'm going to try again, Fabian, to share the screen.
Yeah, trying from mine.
Yes, exactly. Don't worry. You have the better brain, so I'm sure you'll manage. It's telling me a host disabled screen, so. Right, in the meantime, until we actually try to sort this out, perhaps another important take-home message I can tell you straight away is that the increase in the risk of psychological issues, although it's there, these are all eminently solvable. Now you might be saying, yes, of course, I have flats and I can't rent them out. People aren't coming to my shop anymore. I'm an agent for cruise liners. And by the way, cruise liners had a double whammy because not only are tourists not coming, the second issue is that the bad publicity they got because of people being stuck on cruise liners. So there's all this psyche, this inherent psyche. But I think the other, oh, here we are. I think we can probably just about share.
Yeah, it should be fine.
Let's just try this out, right? Okay. There's host disabled attendee screen sharing here, Fabian. Right, okay, so until we sort out this technical issue, I'm also going to talk about these people and how they are or how they can adjust. And in fact, the adjustment is so important that it has a term. It's called adjustment disorder. And this is a very specific, time-limited psychological issue, which lasts anything from 1 month, sometimes up to 6 months. And it can be pretty difficult to overcome, but not impossible. The word crisis, by the way, comes from the Greek word krinein, to decide. And essentially that means that we're at crossroads, and that's why it's an opportunity where we can go one way or the other way. So I think it's important that people are allowed, not only through leadership and management, but also to sustaining the morale of people. So, as I said, without further ado, I'm going to, perfect, here we are, okay. Right, okay, so this is the talk. And I want to again stress that in a crisis, it's not only about moving on. The title over there is perhaps a little bit misleading in the sense that moving on, yes, but also being with is important. And this is one of the main ingredients of psychotherapy, where you are with the person during the hard or challenging times. And again, I'm not qualified to tell you how to manage your businesses. I'm not qualified at all how to tell you how to lead your team or your teams or how to manage your finances. That is not It's enough that I have problems with my own finances, so I'm sure I wouldn't do a very good job. But joking apart, the issue really is about being with people through the thick and the thin. So let's basically go through the obvious, that COVID-19, all right, this new disease, is formed by a new strain. And this is why there's a lot of uncertainty. Only yesterday, there were a total of 29,000, this Austrian Carta research paper on COVID since January. And it's estimated that by the end of the year, there's going to be 2 million research papers. In a way, you might say it's good because obviously there's a lot of research and we're all together behind this to try and find a cure and the vaccine, and that's true. The flip side is that we're getting too much information in too short a time, and we don't have enough time to actually process this information. So you can imagine, with all this in mind, even doctors have a pretty difficult and challenging time to assimilate the information, to go through the information, to pass it on to the politicians, the leaders, to come up with clear, up-to-date, evidence-based information. And that is where we have this sort of bottleneck. So please expect things to change or not to be the same, or somebody to change their version from day to day. The issue is that we're getting too much information. I'm going to give you an example. I have a WhatsApp group with 2,000 doctors from all over the world. The amount of messages which come through is enough to block any of the latest phones you have in 3 days. Such is the barrage of information. A lot of it is good news, a lot of it is fake news, a lot of it is total manipulation. So it's all about filtering. And for those of you who might not be aware, there's something called critical appraisal. Now, critical appraisal in normal situations takes months. So I submit a research paper. It goes through a committee, which is independent, which hasn't got any investments here or there with pharmaceutical companies, etc., which is impartial, and doctors have to, just like good governance dictates, have to declare their own, as it were, interests. And then it's processed. It's what we call a peer review process. Many weeks passed and many months passed, and then the paper is deemed to be scientifically sound or not, according to certain statistical and critical appraisal criteria, and then it's published. And even that is not enough, because one swallow doesn't make a summer. Now imagine if you have 29,000 papers. So you can imagine the process of going through. So please expect the uncertainty. And one way to handle the uncertainty of the crisis is to understand that there are still many things which are uncertain. Only today I was hearing about an old lady, a patient of mine in the clinic, who was worried about receiving Holy Communion, because she was saying, quite rightly, if the host drops in the palm of my hand, but the one before would have touched the priest's finger, what happens? And these are important, pertinent questions. So it's spreading fast, and it still is around us. Let's be very careful. I don't want to sound alarmist. And yes, there are ways to keep a business going without all this fake news, all this deception. And please, please, please ask about the source. Check the source. I'll give you another example. Oxford University, one of the pioneers in vaccine research, gave the vaccine to 2 people. They were 2 scientists, and they came on BBC and on the news. The following day, there was some news somewhere which said that one of them died. This poor lady came up without makeup, hair a little bit out of place, and said, listen, I'm still alive. So just to show you how, please be careful where and what you get, where the information comes from. So it's spreading fast. So far, there's no vaccine. There's a lot of trials. There's 80 to 90 trials going on around the world. So this is unprecedented. And again, for those of you who are worried, the technology, the rate of research, the collaboration is such that whereas before a vaccine would come out in 6, 7, 8, even 9 years, nowadays with all this collaboration and technology, we can actually come with a safe vaccine within a very short time. Would I take it? Absolutely yes. And let's be clear, there are also these other theories, conspiratorial theories, that vaccines don't work, vaccines are harmful. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear about this. These are things which come up, people have access to grind. I'm not going to be the moralist here, and I'm not the scientist because I'm not an expert, but I do know that we need to do something about this virus, and we are. And again, it does, because the sooner we sort this out and these uncertainties, then the shopkeeper morale is better, the sales assistant's morale is better, teamwork is better, you don't go to work in a totally horrible mood, you don't go back to your husband in a totally horrible mood. So it has a ripple effect. Now, people are understandably frightened and concerned, but there's a difference between unbridled anxiety and unsettled uncertainty. So I think it's important to make this distinction, and this is part of the therapy. This is what we call in psychology crisis management. Essentially, I'm just giving you a perspective of the number of deaths. Okay, remember up here, cardiovascular disease remains the biggie, the big one, okay, with 48,742 deaths. This is a particular recent research. If you look at the bottom over there, okay, as of between December the 31st and May the 15th, the average was around 2,000, 2,200 deaths. And that's quite significant. And please, let's be careful about this. We cannot lower our guard. Yes, thank goodness we have fewer numbers, but even those numbers, the good scientists, the good analysts would say, hang on, those are the ones which are detected. That doesn't mean that there's 1 or 2 or 6 or 12 in Malta and Gozo. There are many more. And we really have to continue taking our precautions. Again, this is another graphic slide which shows the proportions. Let's not forget, and this is another appeal, the problem we're having at the moment is that people are scared to go to hospital. I was speaking to a friend of mine, a cardiologist yesterday, who was telling me, he said, people are getting heart attacks in the community. They come in and it's too late to rescue their heart. Likewise, I'm seeing my patients, not at outpatients for the moment, but I'm seeing them at the polyclinic, at the police station, on Mosta Bridge, at Lahrash Tal-Meliha, in Valletta. So we need to now resume our outpatients. And the appeal again is, if you're unwell or you have complex issues or simple issues, it could just be diabetes or blood pressure or cholesterol, have them checked. Speak to your doctor. You have enough on your plate. Finances, markets, stocks. I don't even want to go there. As I said, I'm out of my depth here, but I can only imagine the headaches. Don't have the headaches, because if you have your physical health at stake or psychological health at stake, obviously that's going to have repercussions. So the issue is this. The number of deaths, as you saw before, is already high. I'll just go back to it very quickly. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, these are still there. The biggies are still there. The problem is that this virus, like any virus, can worsen, compound, or tip the balance against you. The originality, if you like, about this virus is that it's deadly, and that so far there's no cure. And it seems to have jumped, as far as we know, the first time in the history of mankind, from an animal onto the human being. Then, as you know, there's fake news about it being engineered, about it being crafted, designed by the Americans against the Russians, or by the Israelis against... It's all fake news. It's interesting news, but so far there hasn't been any corroborated evidence. You see, and I like to use this example. I could say that whiskey kills the coronavirus. Some people would say, yes, it was out on the internet, but I have to prove what I say. So just by drinking whiskey, does that cure it or not? And again, you have to make not one trial, but several trials, which are repeatable in many, many countries by different people. If then the statistics show that whiskey does, to give you this example, it doesn't, but it does cure coronavirus, then it starts being implemented in the world. I've got no shares for whiskey stock, so don't worry, all those who sell whiskey, I've got no, so I'm admitting my disclosures over here. But you can see down there, the list is long, and people continue to die of these things: dementia, digestive problems, diabetes, and so on and so forth. So I think don't lose the big picture. Keep well, keep healthy, because if I don't take care of my liver, my kidney, my spleen, my diabetes, my heart, if, God forbid, I'm affected by any virus, including coronavirus, the outcome is worse. So it's important to adopt this holistic perspective. Again, this is why the fear of coronavirus comes about, because people perhaps don't keep this in perspective. We know that the older people are more predisposed, and that's why they have to be protected more, and the vulnerable, those are on chemotherapy, the immunosuppressed. And again, even those, we're noticing there's an increased risk of psychological issues. So reach out and get help if you need to, both in the physical and psychological perspective. Okay, so the psychology of fear, and this is where the issue coming, because sometimes it's not the germs that kill us, but our body's response to them, which is known as an allergy. In the same sense, germs are compared to our suffering. How our lives turn out depends on how we react to that suffering. And that's why mental immunity is important, what we call resilience nowadays. And really and truly, it's important to keep a natural component, a powerful component, even the primitive component. I'm going to explain what I mean in a minute. But you cannot have health without mental health. That was a slogan which was implemented in 2004 by the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK. No health without mental health. And I think we need to redress this, because what I'm seeing in my crisis team, what I'm seeing whilst discussing among colleagues, is that now the effects of quarantine, the effects of isolation, the effects of not being able to see my grandparents, my children, this is where the situation now is getting more complicated. And if you remember in the beginning, whilst we were trying to adjust to other technical difficulties, I spoke about adjustment disorder. And I'm also going to talk about PTSD. But back to resilience. So what is resilience? Resilience is that dynamic, is that, if you like, quality where we store up psychological strength to be able to handle any crisis. And you can still do it now. And I want to talk about that in a minute. So the non-stop media cycle surrounding the outbreak. And this is important. It's important to keep this in mind, because a journalist is an extremely powerful professional. Thank goodness Malta is endowed with a number of good journalists who do their best to get good information from the right source, and their writing is in keeping with ethics and guidelines which are applicable to their profession. So I think what I'm talking about here is an availability bias. Who are my sources? Are they impartial? Are they across the board? Am I showing both sides of the coin? So that's quite important to remember. And again, I worry about, colleagues like mine worry about people, not about people who have an IQ of 180. I worry about people who have an IQ of 18. That is the issue, because these people may not necessarily understand the difference between sensationalism, between fake news, real news, semi-real news. So it's up to you. And again, I'm noticing a lot of teams, a lot of businesses, a lot of establishments are actually having what I call a 10-minute pep talk about COVID. And then the other 50 minutes, they get on with their work and business. And I think it's important to do that. Now, some of you might be saying, okay, but I have no work, or work is limited. It's true. But perhaps what comes to mind now is making hay whilst the sun shines. I'm not only talking about filing, about reorganizing your files. A clerk the other day told me, I'm sick and tired of organizing papers here and there. Well, this is a time for training. This is a time for reflection, for understanding, for team building. One needs to be innovative. And as I said, there's no magic formula on how to sort this. Each, in their own way, can try to find a solution. The good thing is that something like your chamber actually has what we call the principle of universality. So the principle of universality means that you are not alone. Irvine Yalom, a famous therapist who lived through World War II, was involved in the Nazi concentration camps, wrote a lot about this concept, that we're all in the same boat, not only in Malta, not only in Gozo and Comino, but all over the world. And I think it's important to keep in mind, we're perhaps at different stages of the disease, but the idea of being aware, the idea of being patient, being resilient, this is already the beginning of crisis resolution. And by the end of this talk, by the way, I didn't tell you, I hope and I trust that you will all be members of the crisis team, whether you like it or not, because this is what crisis management is all about. So. Okay, so you see these things going on, people shopping and empty stacks. And this is again where you as leaders need to come in, where you need to lead yourself by example to keep people calm. You, as I said, are crisis team members as well. And people will look up to you, people will follow your example, whether it's one way or the other. So it's quite important that you keep a balance, that you get information on the right sources and look at the bigger picture. And where you're struggling, that's no problem. Get help. Gone are the days when we used to say that, you seek help means you're weak. That's absolute nonsense. Actually, research shows the opposite, that if you actually reach out, if you actually realize that you need help, that shows a sign of maturity and strength. Again, uncertainty also leaves room for false claims, and this is where the scaremongering issue comes in the way. So in the middle of the outbreak, this can lead to behavior that amplifies the transmission, going out, holding, not implementing hand hygiene. So please keep these things going. I was speaking to an entrepreneur last week, and he said, I'm ordering big notices, that we care about you. And he's ordered big jugs of sanitizers for his shop. He's got a cosmetics shop. So anyway, so these are ways in which you can actually be innovative and creative. The flip side, the good thing about coronavirus is that the whole world now has had a crash course or is having a crash course in epidemiology, virology, and public health. That is the equivalent of third year medical school. That's 6 months worth. So that's the other thing. Obviously, I smile, but I can imagine the issues, and our heart goes out to those people who suffer, those people who lost their loved ones. It's quite a tough job. And remember, as I always say, you're all the frontliners. We are all the frontliners. Doctors are, if anything, we are the last line of defense. Because depending on how people behave or not behave, that will determine the outcome of the disease. And please remember, numbers are limited by their sample rates. In other words, just because there's one or two doesn't mean that there are people around in the community and we can't lower our guards. Remember something else, that our memories play tricks on us. We have what we call selective abstraction in our memory. When things are good, we tend to remember more of the good. We idealize. When things are bad, we tend to think more of the bad things and amplify them. So please keep this psychological principle in mind. So when things are good, we exaggerate the good in our memories when we reminisce. But when things are bad, we think about the bad things, but we tend to amplify them. And again, a hallmark, one of the ways to reframe this, or as in psychology speak, cognitive reframing, one way we do this is precisely by looking at the big picture and reminding people that, listen, yes, there were these issues, but look at all the progress we made. And yes, there are deaths, and once again, our heart goes out to them and they need support. But look at the big picture. A lot of people who passed away on the front line, doctors, had pre-existing conditions, unfortunately. Obviously, one loss is one too many. And I'm not by any means belittling a loss. People are not numbers. People have a face, a mummy, a daddy, a pet dog, a business, etc. So I think it's important to keep this in mind. Okay, so ways to look after your mental health. Accurate information. Limits around the news to COVID-19. My mantra is, if you have 60 minutes in an hour, spend 10 minutes talking about COVID, but please spend the next 50 minutes talking about yourselves, talking about others, getting on with your life. And it's important to keep that balance. Don't forget your children, very important. Don't forget where you have your discussions about your business, about your finances. Your children, your loved ones could be hearing, and you could be scaring them without realizing. And I know that as leaders, as people in charge of your business, you know a thing or two about human psychology. You may have not studied psychology, but I'm sure you know quite a lot about psychology because you handle people every single day. And therefore, you will know this, that you setting the example will allow other people to follow suit and make it easier for them to be serene. And if they're serene and focused, then they can give their all wherever they are, whether they're at front office, reception, selling fish, trying to rent an apartment, etc. Look after yourself. So anybody out there, the alcohol, the drugs, the caffeine, the nicotine, the cocaine, the marijuana, the gambling, think about these people. And if you're there, there is help. Reach out because we can help you. And there's also something else, reaching out to the bottom to support each other. Nowadays, we have a supermarket worth of services all over, radio, television, online, telephone numbers. Everybody is doing a really good job to help. It's really this, as I say in Italian, l'imbarazzo della scelta. Maintain a sense of hope. Yes, it's going to stop. Yes, it will finish. And yes, there will be light at the end of the tunnel. Crisis, by definition, is temporary. What worries me are those people who don't look at it this way, who start losing hope, start getting desperate, and start feeling that they're in a corner. That is where the warning signs start switching on in my brain. And I want to tell you how to identify these people to get them to get help. Acknowledge your feelings. That, I think, is important. There's another manager who actually has a meeting every day, 10 minutes, sits down and asks them, how are you feeling? And obviously things go on about COVID, but not only COVID. The children who are getting restless, the dog who gets restless as well, the wife who gets restless, the aunt who gets restless. But talking about it is already cathartic. It's already a step forward to treatment. Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder. This is perhaps one of the two, a very, very common problem with post-traumatic stress. And I'm going to show you the signs and symptoms. We're beginning to conclude our talk, and what to do and where to get help. So post-traumatic stress disorder was associated with combat neuroses. In other words, people who started in the Vietnam War, people who came back from the Vietnam War, who were shell-shocked, who were withdrawn, who took drugs, took alcohol, and who changed in their personality. And complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a new term which has actually been applied to COVID-19 illness, because the trauma is ongoing. You wake up in the morning, you don't know what's going to happen. You're not sure about your business. You're not sure about your stocks and shares. You're not sure about your property. You're not sure about your kids' education. You're not sure if your kids are going to manage to recover next year. You're not sure about where you can go to swim. You're not sure about your sports. Those who used to go to the gym have stopped now. Okay, now it's going to open again. But, so it's a complex, if you like, collage. And there are flashbacks and nightmares. And I'm going back to social media, sensational video clips of people in Wuhan screaming inside that they can't get out. And there are people who are getting nightmares about this, about people dying on respirators, about people making these very, very, very passionate pleas on the internet about what to do with the respirator, what not to do. Don't do this and don't do that. What's it called? Shock therapy. Cemeteries showing open graves. My question, and I'm not going to put a judgment on all this, but my question is, how helpful are these videos? Should I allow myself or my young children to watch them? In the long term, is it going to help? I can tell you that some people are affected negatively and they get nightmares and flashbacks about this. And I'm talking about people who are obsessed with cleanliness, what we call obsessive compulsive disorder. They're imprisoned at home, people who can't go out. So there's a lot of suffering. And again, if you have these problems, please do get in touch. Okay, so most people who go through these traumatic events may have temporary difficulty adjusting and coping, but with time and good self-care, most of them get better. So you have it within yourself to cope. The problem is if people don't cope, so they don't eat, they don't wash, they don't sleep well, they become irritable, they turn to drugs, to alcohol, they even think about harming themselves. And this is another important one which I want to talk about later. This can last for months or even years after the crisis. Again, so what are the symptoms? As I said, avoiding contact, avoiding social interaction, negative changes in your mood, intrusive memories about what's going to happen, how am I going to cope, people screaming, death, people on respirators, and outbursts. And again, we're seeing, unfortunately, a lot of couples who at the moment are breaking up, having arguments. I mean, I joke that obviously, I'm thinking about that Italian who tied his wife with sellotape on the wall. Okay, perhaps a bit of humor here. Obviously, you wouldn't do that, but it just goes to show how people apply this ironically. But yes, it can be very taxing. And my heart goes out to those who are victims of domestic abuse, domestic violence. Again, don't suffer alone. There is help. These intrusive memories, and recurrent, unwanted, and distressing. You relived a traumatic event. Dreams and nightmares, and even emotional distress and physical symptoms like neck pain, back pain. These also are very traumatic and can actually cause a lot of problems to the person. Because if you have this, you can't perform at the shop or at your business. Trying to avoid thinking or talking about the traumatic event, that's another thing. People avoid and they withdraw, and avoiding places or activities that you might remind you of the traumatic effect. That is why a lot of people aren't going to Mater Dei Hospital or to their clinics. Please, as I said, it's crucially important that if you or somebody is suffering, do get in touch, because you really would need to get some support for this if you can't manage alone, that is, or one of your loved ones can't manage alone. The negative thinking, negative thoughts about yourself, hopelessness about the future, problems with not being able to remember, difficulty maintaining a relationship, feeling detached, lack of interest in your hobbies, activities, and the difficulty to experience positive emotions and feeling emotionally numb or comfortably numb, in a way, for some people who want to detach and they sort of have their own comfort zone. Being easily startled or frightened, these are the physical and emotional reactions, always being on guard, self-destructive behavior such as drinking too much or driving too fast. Again, my theory is that the accidents we've had, apart from the fact that people want to be let loose, people could have actually suffered. I'm not obviously going into the specifics here. I'm not referring to anybody in particular, but please beware that dangerous driving and drinking don't go well together. That's a no-brainer, but that could also be related to post-traumatic stress disorder. Trouble sleeping, concentration, irritability, anger, and obviously if you have an irritable supermarket stacker, it can reflect badly on your business and on your public relations. So think about that, ask, check, invest in your human resources, as you know, which is probably one of the most important resources you have, as you know much more than me. Overwhelming guilt or shame that you may have transmitted the virus to somebody else or through your carelessness done that. So PTSD symptoms can vary in intensity over time. You may have more PTSD symptoms when you're stressed in general, or when you come across reminders. And let's face it, COVID is the rule of the day at the moment. When do you see a doctor? And this is quite important. Or when do you see a therapist? If you're getting these disturbing events for more than a month now, and you're not yourself, or your friends or relatives tell you, you're not yourself, get help. And now this is probably one of the most important slides. We do see, unfortunately, between 20 to 40 suicides every year in Malta and Gozo. For every person that commits suicide, there are 20 trying. For every person who commits suicide or is trying to commit suicide, there are 6 people, according to WHO, who are at risk of mental health problems, at risk of losing their job, at risk of dropping out of education, at risk of not marrying, being marginalized, and at risk of committing suicide themselves. So I think this is crucially important to understand, because the ultimate tragedy in psychological health is suicide. You can't get back from that. And that's why a crisis team is so important. Think of a crisis team as the casualty for the mind. And again, if I may, there's a 24/7 free service, which has been there for the last 10 years. The consultation is free. It runs throughout the year, and it's 24/7. And the number is 9933 9966. I'll say it again, 9933 9966. If you need the number, I'll be happy to pass it on later. And also, there's also a foundation, which is in being conceived. It's called Fondazione Soccorso il Pronto, which is essentially going to help, or which is helping people who are thinking about suicide. It's going to help people who are contemplating actively, who need help now. And it will also help those people who lost somebody to suicide, or who thankfully survived a suicide attempt. So 9933 9966. There's also a Facebook page of one of the main stakeholders, which is Crisis Resolution Malta. You're obviously very welcome to contact us anonymously, and I'm sure you'll get help over there by trained professionals. So this is the specific service for crisis, specifically for suicidal thinking or suicide attempts. And again, it can be very devastating. And unfortunately, you may know in your line of work that there are people in business who have problems, who lost their life or who took their life because of something which was temporary or something which was overwhelming. When research shows that, ironically, when these things, there would have been a recovery plan. It's not easy, and we're not saying that there's a magic formula, but let's put it this way. Taking one's life will certainly diminish the odds permanently of recovery. So whilst it's hard and it's difficult, so I appeal to all the 100 plus participants we have, and thank you very much for joining. Questions, by the way, are welcome. I can answer right now, or online, or anonymously through Fabian, or through your chamber. I cannot overemphasize this enough. Suicide is unfortunately very present in Malta. We calculate that on average there's about 1,000 people thinking about suicide every year, more or less, some grosso modo, but it's the legacy which is very painful. The legacy of moving from one generation to another. So if one of my relatives committed suicide, I am 100 times more likely to commit suicide. So keep that in mind, please. Again, you can develop post-traumatic stress disorder, as I said, through the various threats, perceived threats of socioeconomic loss, poverty, death, or the fear of death, not going around. And again, education is key. This is where you come in by managing. Entrepreneurs are by definition charming. I remember from my school days, the people who are in the account and economics class. I don't know if there's anybody out there who used to come from De La Salle. Hello from here. But anyway, I do remember that these guys were charming, intuitive, they were leaders. And this is what you have to be. Yes, the storm is here. Yes, seas are a bit rough, but we have to go into port. And I know these are maybe nice words and people are worrying, but we have to rein in and look at the big picture. Let's put it this way. Research shows that you're more likely to cope with a crisis if you're psychologically and physically fit, as opposed to if you decompensate. So I think it pays. Again, doctors are unsure why some people get PTSD and why others don't. Nor are they sure why people get an adjustment disorder or not, which we're going to talk about in a minute. The fact remains, just like we don't know why somebody gets cancer or not. There are many factors, some are genetic, some are lifestyle issues. What you don't want to drop more salt in the wound. I think that's important. So the vices, avoid those, healthy lifestyle, sleeping, eating, and get help. 99339966. That's a 24-hour free telephone consultation service for the crisis team. Risk factors, as I said, it's a no-brainer here. Predisposing conditions, poverty, poor education, drug taking, risky behavior. These are all abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence. These are all sort of combat, war, being raised in an orphanage, not everybody, but these are all, the earlier development problems. These are all risk factors. Does it mean that you'll get post-traumatic stress if you have all this? No, because there's nature and nurture. So if you have a very good upbringing, you take care of yourself, and even if you have bad genes, if you know what I mean, you're not likely to get post-traumatic stress. Again, having pre-existing anxiety and depression, lack of a support system, so please tie in. I'm sure you have your own WhatsApp groups and you talk and chit and chat. I know some businesses do. I know the cruise line group has. This is where you become resilient. This is where you become innovative. This is where you become creative. And this is where you find a solution, where you take the right path when you're at crossroads in a crisis. Complications can be physical, psychological, eating problems as well, suicidal thoughts, as I said. So again, getting help, like everything else, like diabetes, like hypertension, like cholesterol, getting help for psychological issues earlier on does help. It helps you, your family. There are fewer days off sick. Again, we're seeing a lot of that at the moment. People are coming to us for certificates because they just can't cope. So it pays to take care of you and your staff by imparting this information. Now, again, these are a few tips to help you deal with your stress about money and the economy. Again, pausing but not panic. I think it's quite important to think about, again, looking at the right scales, looking at big pictures, remembering that stocks and shares tumbled like 9/11. I don't know about you, but I lost quite a few stocks and shares. So, history does repeat itself. The Great Recession in the 1900s and the 1800s, the Greek situation, again, you'd know more than me. I'm no economist and I don't claim to be, or an accountant. I just give my accountant a lot of headaches, and thanks for people like you guys. But anyway, you know what I mean. So look at the big picture. Identify your stresses and make a plan, just like we make management plan for crisis. There's a business plan, which I'm sure you're more adept, and there is help. We help as doctors, we help as crisis team members, we help a lot of people. We send them, for example, to the Linus Piteri Foundation, who do sterling work, for example, in guiding people through professionals, accountants, managers, business people, to mentor these people, to help them through the crisis. And by the way, helping others is healthy for your brain. It makes you more resilient and helps you overcome a crisis better. So it does help to do charitable work in one way or another. Okay, essentially, we said avoiding the smoking, the drinking, the gambling, getting help from economic advisors, government subsidies, etc. Now, this is easier said than done, turning a challenge into an opportunity. Because when I've got zero income, and there are companies that have zero income, then what do you do? Well, again, I wish I could snap my finger and help you, ladies and gentlemen, but I do know for sure that sitting down around tables does produce solutions, does produce viable alternatives. And again, I'll leave it at that. So thinking creatively, thinking out of the box. The important thing is that if you start feeling that there's no hope, you think you can't be helped, that is where you might need some help. And by the way, ħanajda bil-Malti mhux biex inbellalkom il-pilloli, this is not to give you pills, because a lot of the treatments nowadays have evolved. There's talk therapy, lifestyle therapy, there's magnetic therapy, not shock therapy, magnetic therapy, which actually helps to restore the wires, because the brain isn't only about chemicals, it's also about switches and wires. You need all three to work together. I compare the brain to a petrol tank. It's pointless having the best petrol inside if there's a hole in my petrol tank. And the hole is because the wires cut off because of traumatic events. And sometimes you might need some help and support. And it's amazing how more powerful, more insightful, how sharper one is when these things are addressed. So look at the big picture and get help when you need it. The warning signs, this is another very important final sections. Learn how to recognize the danger signals, because you too are members of this team. The person will talk about committing suicide, won't sleep well, won't eat well, drastic changes in behavior, closing up accounts, Facebook pages, drawing up a will, saying their goodbyes, loses interest in school, work or hobbies, writes a will, makes final arrangements, pays up their debts or leaves them, and gives away prized possessions. And if you know anybody there around you in your neck of the woods, please do reach out. 9933 9966. 9933 9966. I can assure you, as much as it is painful to lose somebody, it is exhilaratingly rewarding to know that you have helped somebody. And you too are members of this team. Suicide attempts before, taking unnecessary risks. These are also other important risk factors. Recently experienced losses, preoccupied with death or dying, loses interest in his or her personal appearance, increases alcohol or drug use. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of this talk. I don't know, Fabian, if there are any questions around, I'd be happy to take them here or in private. Over to you, Fabian.
Dr. Shwirab, thank you very much for those insights, and basically, definitely, most of us and most of those following us will definitely need some of these tips. But perhaps now one of the main problems is also some people might be finding it difficult to return to normality. So back to work. Of course, there is also one of the questions, there's difficulties perhaps because of children, but let's leave that for now on the side. There's problems also that perhaps I'm comfortable at home, I'm comfortable with the new lifestyle, but now we need to get back to normality. How can we help ourselves perhaps, Dr. Shwirab?
That's a very good question, Fabian. And in fact, it is such an important question that there's something called the re-entry syndrome or the restart syndrome. Essentially, it is what you're saying, that how do you go back from 0 to 100 without injuring yourself physically and psychologically? Ask any marathon runner, ask any fitness enthusiast. You can't just go at the deep end straight away, because you're going to get hurt. You're going to get injured physically and then psychologically. There is no real magic wand formula for able to do this. However, we get this question asked time and time again. So much so that there's a separate webinar which I've set up, called the re-entry syndrome, the restart syndrome. There are various tips, so perhaps we can talk about that next time. But a few points to sort of keep in mind. I'm seeing, and by the way, thank you very much for all the many, many comments over here on the side. I really appreciate and grateful. I've actually put the number again, our 24/7 free crisis line, for those who might need to use it. Getting back isn't about going back like before. People use these terms like the new normal and life isn't going to be the same. I would be a bit careful. I would say, look, how can I, as Fabian, as Mark, as Chris, or whatever, get back into what I was and continue with life? Because, by the way, people are forgetting one very small detail, that life is never the same. Life is never what it was yesterday. So there's always this continuum. What my history teacher used to say, the only constant in life is the continuum of change. So I think acknowledging that Okay, it could COVID, it could have been something else, it could have been chickenpox, it could have been whatever, an asteroid coming to hit the world, God forbid not, but you know what I mean. So I think we need to keep this in mind. So making a plan, a recovery plan, writing it down. I'm a stickler for lists, Fabian. So writing down on the famous, using the kitchen, the fridge magnet and making your list there, or on your Google Calendar, or on your whatever, on your Facebook agenda, whatever. Make a plan. But don't expect things to be before, because you know what? Things are never going to be like before. They never were. People speak about the new normal. I prefer talking about business as usual with a difference, because it's usual and it's different. So again, if you identify with any of these issues like adjusting or having post-traumatic stress or depression or hopelessness or helplessness, that is where you might need to get help. Everybody is creative enough, and certainly your members, Fabian, have enough creativity and ingenuity and motivation, because management is part of leadership and leadership is part of management, to do this. So how to get on is to acknowledge that things won't remain the same, to watch out for the warning signs. And when you've acknowledged that things are not going to be the same, when you've gone through the warning signs, devise a plan, individually or collectively.
Thank you very much, Dr. Choueireb. I think we've covered most of the urgent points at this point. Thank you very much for being with us. For sure we're going to meet in the coming weeks. We'll need definitely more insights about how to cope with the new normality. And I would like also to let our members know that we will keep on updating you. As I mentioned previously, we will be having also next week another webinar related to the COVID budget that will be announced on Monday, 8th June. Thank you very much, Dr. Choueireb. Thanks to all those following us on our Zoom webinar and also on Malta Chamber of SMEs Facebook page. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All the very best and stay safe. Good luck. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks.